A ruthless martial artist humiliates an old man in a crowded restaurant, then challenges the wrong stranger to a fight. What he doesn't know, that quiet man sipping tea is John Wick himself. What happens next silences the entire room and changes one life forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The red lanterns above the Golden Pearl restaurant swayed gently in the early afternoon breeze. Nestled deep in the heart of Chinatown, the place was a comforting blend of tradition and simplicity. Fragrant steam drifted from the kitchen through hand-carved archways, carrying hints of jasmine rice and ginger. Beneath the soft murmur of conversations and the occasional clink of porcelain, something deeper held the place together. A quiet kind of dignity. Keanu Reeves stepped in through the side entrance, not the front. He wore a brown canvas jacket, a faded gray t-shirt beneath it, and a well-worn cap pulled low over his brow. Most people wouldn't have recognized him. That was the point. He didn't come here to be seen. He came because this place meant something. He paused just past the threshold, letting his eyes scan the room with deliberate calm. The same silk divider still hung in the corner, painted with dragons twisting through misty clouds. The same jade plant still leaned toward the sunlit window, slightly crooked, still thriving. Keanu offered a small nod to no one in particular, then slipped into the corner booth, half hidden behind the divider. Mr. Wang hadn't changed much either. A little grayer, a little slower, but his presence still held the same gravity. He moved with a gentle authority, greeting customers with soft bows, taking orders by memory, correcting nothing and yet making everything run smoothly. His apron was as crisp as ever, tied high at the waist. His long white hair was neatly pulled back into a knot. To the untrained eye, he was just a kind old man running a family restaurant. But to Keanu, he was something more. A mentor, a fighter, and once, the man who taught him how to fall without fear. Years ago, before fame, before movies, Keanu had trained under Mr. Wang for a small film that never made it to theaters. What mattered wasn't the film, it was what he learned. The way Mr. Wang moved, taught, protected, those things stayed with him longer than any script ever had. So when Mr. Wang decided to open a restaurant, tired of showbiz and wire rigs, Keanu quietly backed him. No one knew. That's how he wanted it. Now he sipped a hot cup of oolong, watching the steam curl upward. He didn't want to interrupt, just observe. A mother showed her son how to hold chopsticks correctly. An old man chuckled at something in the paper. Two college students argued over who owed more on the check. The noise was ordinary, beautifully so. Then, the bell over the front door jingled. It was a soft sound, harmless to most, but Keanu's fingers paused around his teacup. Something shifted in the air, the kind of shift a seasoned fighter feels before a punch is thrown. He didn't look up. Not yet, because he already knew the storm had entered the room. The door creaked open wider, and a tall man stepped through, blocking the afternoon light behind him. He didn't pause to look around. He didn't hesitate at the threshold. He walked in like he owned the space, each step loud enough to challenge the quiet rhythm of the restaurant. Thick boots pounded across the tile, his bomber jacket zipped halfway up, sleeves stretched tight over muscular arms. He moved like someone who expected the world to move first. Keanu's eyes rose beneath the shade of his cap. Just once. Just enough. The man didn't wait for a host. He didn't ask for a menu. He just picked the table closest to the room's center and dragged a chair out with a screech that cut through the quiet. People turned to look, subtle and cautious. He sat down, wide-legged, leaning back with one arm thrown carelessly over the backrest, as if daring someone to challenge his presence. Behind the counter, Mr. Wang paused, his hand still wrapped around a teapot. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did, like a ripple beneath calm water. A young server approached the man with a polite smile, bowing slightly. "Good afternoon. May I bring you some tea?" The man scoffed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You can bring me something that doesn't taste like boiled socks." The words hung in the air, rude, deliberate, and meant to provoke. The server hesitated. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his apron, unsure whether to respond. Mr. Wang gave the smallest nod from the counter, and the young man bowed and turned away, silent. Keanu watched all of it, not reacting, not judging, just watching. The man picked up a menu, glanced at it, then dropped it onto the table with a heavy thud. The place served sea cucumber next to lemon chicken. Pick a country and stick to it. A few diners exchanged glances. One woman shifted in her seat. An elderly man frowned. The once warm air of the Golden Pearl now felt strained, thinner. The man leaned back farther, stretching like a cat that knew no one would dare kick it. Then, his chair suddenly scraped back across the floor, not to leave, to intrude. He crashed into the table behind him, the one where an elderly couple had just received their tea. The teapot toppled. The old man gasped, reaching to catch it. Too late. The hot tea spilled across his lap. His wife jumped, fumbling for napkins, her hands trembling. The man looked down at the mess he caused and smirked. Oops. No apology, no concern. Keanu's hand lowered gently to the table, flat, fingers spread. His posture didn't change, but the stillness around him began to concentrate. Something was building. Not anger, not fear, but precision. The Golden Pearl, once a haven of quiet laughter and tea-scented comfort, now felt like a room holding its breath. And it had only just begun. Mr. Wang stepped out from behind the counter. His apron was still clean. His face still calm, but his steps were measured, like someone walking through a place they once trusted, now checking for cracks. He reached the elderly couple and offered them soft words, barely above a whisper. They nodded, shaken but grateful, accepting the fresh napkins and the dignity in his voice. Then Mr. Wang turned to the man who caused it. "Sir," he said, voice firm but respectful, "please be mindful. There are other guests here." The man barked a laugh. "What kind of dump doesn't reinforce its chairs?" he said. "Maybe if your food was worth what you're charging, I'd be in a better mood." Half the restaurant went silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. The barista behind the counter stopped frothing milk. Even the tourist couple in the corner lowered their phones. All eyes were drifting toward the center of the room. Not with drama, with concern. Keanu still didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence had already shifted. He was no longer just a guest in the shadows. He was the one watching the storm approach, quietly calculating the wind. The man squinted at Mr. Wang. "Wait a second," he said, suddenly recognizing something. "You're that guy, aren't you? That old kung fu dude from the training videos. What happened? Retired from pretending to fight and opened a noodle shop?" There was venom in the words, not just mockery, intention. Mr. Wang's jaw clenched, but he didn't lose his poise. His voice stayed level. "You've made your point. Please pay for your drink and leave." The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills. He slapped them onto the counter but didn't hand them over. "Not for this trash," he said, louder, letting the bills flutter to the floor like insults. Silence. A deep, almost eerie silence filled the Golden Pearl. And then came a sound, small, clear, a ceramic clink. Keanu Reeves placing his teacup gently back into the saucer. That was all. But it echoed. Mr. Wang moved to retrieve the fallen bills. He crouched carefully, hand reaching toward the $10 note. But before his fingers could touch it, the man struck. A palm thrust, sharp and sudden, into Mr. Wang's chest. It wasn't a wild punch. It was practiced, deliberate, the kind meant to prove a point. Mr. Wang staggered. His shoulder hit the edge of the counter with a sickening crack. He dropped to one knee, a hiss of pain escaping his lips. His sleeve darkened as blood bloomed from his elbow. A collective gasp rippled through the room, but no one moved. Except Keanu. He didn't rise. He didn't speak. He simply lowered his hand from the table, curled it slowly into a fist beneath the cloth, and the storm, once distant, had now fully arrived. Li Wei had always wanted attention, but not the kind earned by respect. His was the kind taken by force. At 32, he was known across Chinatown for two things: a flashy chain of self-defense gyms and a short temper that masked deep insecurity. Years ago, he'd been booted from a respected martial arts academy for starting fights in the ring and disrespecting elders. Ever since, he'd built his reputation by tearing others down loudly, publicly, visibly. He called it confidence. Others whispered different words. Now, standing tall in the center of the Golden Pearl, Li Wei had found his stage again. His eyes scanned the room like a king addressing his court, though no one had knelt to him, and no one would. "You call this a restaurant?" he said, tossing a menu toward the floor. "I've seen vending machines and gas stations with better selection." No one laughed. A young woman at the bar bit her lip. A father covered his toddler's ears. Two tourists started gathering their things. The warmth that had filled the Golden Pearl only moments earlier was bleeding out, replaced by a tension that tightened across every table. Behind the counter, Mr. Wang remained upright despite the hit to his chest. The pain was clear. His arms stiff, one leg trembling slightly, but his spirit did not waver. He placed a cloth over the bruise beneath his elbow and walked back toward the center. Li's voice cut through the murmurs again. "You're lucky I didn't knock you out," he said to Mr. Wang. "But I don't hit people over 60. It's a bad look on social media." Keanu still sat in his booth, but now his body leaned slightly forward. His cap, still low, didn't hide the sharpness in his eyes. He didn't need to move to command presence. His silence was no longer passive, it was watchful, tactile, like the pause before a perfectly timed strike. Mr. Wang drew a deep breath. "You are not welcome here, Li." That name, spoken aloud, it landed like a stone. Li's jaw tightened. "So you do remember me?" "I remember a student who walked with pride but learned nothing from his teachers." Li took a step forward. "I walked away because your generation is stuck in myths. Real fighting happens on concrete, not in calligraphy scrolls. You teach weakness. I teach domination. You teach shame." The words were quiet, delivered without venom, but they cut deeper than any punch. Li laughed sharply. Big words for someone who just hit the ground. And then, in one quick motion, Li turned and shoved another chair, this one striking a server who had quietly returned to check on the elderly couple. The server stumbled back, falling hard against a table. Glass shattered. The old woman cried out in fright. The entire restaurant stood still. Even the clatter of broken dishes seemed afraid to echo. And in the booth, Keanu Reeves finally stood up. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout or stride across the room like a movie hero. He simply stood. But the moment he did, the atmosphere shifted like a fault line under tension. Li Wei noticed. Everyone did. The man who had laughed moments ago now narrowed his eyes at the tall figure rising from the corner booth. There was no fear in Keanu's stance, no theatrics, just a presence. A presence Li couldn't quite define. Not yet. Keanu walked forward with deliberate calm, stepping around a chair, pausing to help the fallen server to his feet. No words passed between them. The young man, barely 20, looked at Keanu as if he knew, somehow, that something sacred was about to be restored. Li smirked. Well, I thought I recognized that sad face. What's wrong, John Wick? Forgot your dog again?" A few gasps fluttered through the room, But Keanu didn't flinch. He turned to Mr. Wang first, placing a firm hand on his mentor's uninjured shoulder. Their eyes met. Years of silent history exchanged in one look. Then Keanu stepped forward and faced Lee fully. "You should leave," Keanu said, quiet as a whisper, but it filled the space like thunder. Lee let out a barking laugh. "Or what? You're going to bore me to death with life advice and breath control?" Keanu's gaze didn't shift. "You walk wrong," he said. Lee blinked. "What?" Keanu repeated it. "You walk wrong." There was no insult in his voice, just truth. Calm, unapologetic. Lee's expression twisted into confusion, then anger. "I walk however I want. Who are you to tell me anything?" Keanu took another step, not closing the distance with aggression, but with something more unsettling. Assurance, certainty, like someone who had already mapped every move and was just waiting for time to catch up. "You walk with your ego," Keanu said, "with your chin lifted like you're above the world, with shoulders wide to look strong, but your center is hollow. Your steps aren't grounded. They're loud, because you want to be heard, not understood." Lee stared at him, speechless for a heartbeat. Then he sneered. "You're just jealous the spotlight left you behind." But Keanu's expression didn't change. He wasn't there for ego. He wasn't there for show. "I came to check on a friend," Keanu said, "not to fight. But if you raise your hand again, you'll answer to me." Lee chuckled and spread his arms. "Then come on, old man. Show me what the movies taught you." Keanu didn't move. Not yet. He looked past Lee to the couple still seated, tea-stained and shaken, then to the staff, frozen in fear, and finally to Mr. Wang, breathing heavier now, sweat shining on his brow. And only then did Keanu's foot slide ever so slightly back. Weight shifted, shoulders lowered. Not a challenge, a choice. And Lee had already made his. Li Wei lunged forward with a sharp, dramatic punch, one meant to impress as much as injure. It was fast, trained, but not focused. It came from the shoulders, not the ground. His feet weren't steady, his balance betrayed his power. Keanu barely moved. A tilt of his torso, a soft pivot. Lee's fist sliced through air. The momentum carried Lee forward and Keanu used it. A guiding hand at the wrist, a shift in balance, and Lee stumbled past him. It wasn't violent, it wasn't loud, but it was final. Lee caught himself before he fell, spinning around with a growl, red-faced. "You think you can humiliate me?" Keanu didn't respond. He turned his body slightly, ready, grounded, but not tense. Lee charged again, this time with a kick aimed high. Wrong choice. Keanu stepped inside the arc, deflecting the leg with his forearm, planting his foot in perfect silence and sending Lee tumbling to the floor with a soft, sweeping motion. The restaurant gasped, not because of the fall, but because of the way it happened, quietly, elegantly, like water regrouping around a rock. Lee scrambled to his feet, furious. His confidence had cracked. His bravado no longer filled the room. Now it shrank under the weight of exposure. "This isn't over," he snapped. Keanu tilted his head. "No, it isn't, because you still don't know why you fall." Lee's lip curled. "I fell because you tricked me." "You fell," Keanu said softly, "because you don't listen. You fight for noise, not for peace." Mr. Wang, steadying himself with one hand on the counter, spoke up. "You always fought against shadows, Lee, never with purpose." For a moment, Lee stood in the center of the room, breathing hard, the reality sinking in. He had walked in looking to dominate. He was now a man revealed, stripped of illusion, wrapped in silence. Keanu stepped back, turning to the staff. "Help the couple. Check the server's arm." His voice, calm again, restored something to the room. Lee looked around and saw it. The eyes that once flinched now looked directly at him, not with fear, but with clarity. He wasn't the storm. He was the disturbance that had passed. As he turned to leave, the door swinging shut behind him, no one stopped him. No one called after him. The golden pearl remained still, restored. Keanu approached Mr. Wang again. "You okay?" Mr. Wang nodded slowly. "You came just in time." Keanu glanced at the shattered teacups. "No," he said, voice low almost to himself. "I came late, but I won't be late again." And the quiet hum of a city's beating heart returned. Stronger now. Li Wei leaned on the counter now, his voice dripping with contempt as he stared directly at Mr. Wang. The restaurant had gone completely silent. The soft clatter of dishes and quiet conversation from before, now replaced by an oppressive stillness. Every eye was on them, but none dared intervene. The tension pressed in on the walls like steam in a sealed pot. "You're that guy, right?" Li said, tapping the counter with a mocking rhythm. "The one from those laughable old kung fu videos? The backyard dojo nonsense? Yeah, I remember you. I used to watch your clips for a laugh back in the day." Mr. Wang said nothing. He stood upright behind the counter, eyes level, breathing steady, though the corners of his mouth had tightened. His weathered hands, once calloused from hours of training, now trembled just slightly. Li wasn't done. He threw a glance around the room, inviting the attention of the diners, like an actor milking his moment. "You see, folks, this man used to pretend to teach martial arts. Sold stories about discipline, honor, some ancient Chinese spirit garbage. But look at him now, serving dumplings like a tired uncle at a family reunion." Someone near the window shifted in their seat, the sound too loud in the silence. Keanu didn't move. He remained in the booth, still partially hidden by the divider. But his hand lowered slowly to the table, fingers wrapping around the base of the teacup, calm and deliberate. Li took out a few crumpled bills from his jacket pocket and waved them in the air. "Here," he said, voice loud and taunting, "for the show." He didn't hand them over. Instead, he slapped the money onto the counter with a dismissive flick of the wrist. A few notes fluttered to the floor. "Actually," he said louder, stepping back with theatrical flair, "not for this trash." The bills landed near Mr. Wang's feet. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slow and dignified, Mr. Wang crouched to retrieve them. He bent carefully, one hand on the counter for support, the other reaching toward the money scattered on the floor. That's when it happened. Without warning, Li struck. His palm came down hard in a short, sharp movement, slamming directly into Mr. Wang's chest. The sound was muffled, almost dull, but the impact was real. Mr. Wang staggered back with a gasp, his shoulder clipping the corner of the prep counter behind him. A sickening crack echoed through the restaurant as he collapsed to one knee. Gasps erupted. A young woman near the entrance dropped her chopsticks. A man at the far table pushed his chair back instinctively, but didn't rise. No one did. The fear was real, but so was the shock. This wasn't an argument anymore. It was an attack. Mr. Wang's hand pressed against his elbow, where blood was already soaking through his linen sleeve. His expression was clenched, not from fear but from pain and frustration. He'd spent decades building something here. A home, a sanctuary, and now one arrogant intruder had turned that sanctuary into a spectacle. Li stood over him, puffing up his chest, satisfied with the chaos he had created. "Maybe next time," he smirked. "Don't bend down like a dog." He turned to the room again, holding out his arms. "Anybody want to stop me?" Still, no one moved. Then, a sound, barely audible, the faint clink of ceramic on ceramic. Keanu Reeves placed his teacup gently onto the saucer. It was not a crash. It wasn't even loud, but it cut through the air like lightning. It was the only sound that mattered. Eyes turned. Some had already suspected. The quiet man in the corner booth wasn't ordinary. He hadn't reacted with fear, hadn't shifted in panic. He had been watching, waiting. And now he had spoken. Not with words, but with a gesture more powerful than a shout. Keanu remained seated. His hand rested now on the table, palm down, his eyes fixed on Lee. Calm, cold, centered. Lee, still caught in his victory, hadn't noticed. But the room had. The balance was shifting. Master Wang tried to rise. His right arm braced against the prep counter, while his left hand stayed clutched to the bloodied sleeve, holding pressure against the wound. His breath came in uneven pulls, but his jaw was set. He wouldn't let a coward define him. Not here. Not in this place he'd built. "Leave," he said hoarsely to Lee, barely above a whisper. Lee laughed, mocking and loud. "Leave? I just got here." He took a step forward, looming. "You used to be something, huh? Trained kids in your little courtyard, gave them fortune cookie wisdom about balance and inner peace. You sold fairy tales to gullible parents, and now look at you, slinging spring rolls." The insult hit hard, but Mr. Wang didn't flinch. His silence was sharper than any comeback. Lee reached out, knocked over a tray of freshly steamed dumplings. They scattered across the floor, delicate wrappers torn and glistening. Keanu's eyes tracked the movement. The clatter echoed like a challenge. Lee turned his back on Mr. Wang and addressed the crowd once more. "This whole place is a joke. You're all sitting here pretending like this dump means something." Silence met him, but not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence before something breaks. Keanu Reeves straightened. He didn't rise, not yet, but his spine lengthened, his shoulders squared. His presence, once background, now commanded the room. Only one man hadn't noticed the change. Lee kept pacing, drunk on attention. Mr. Wang, breath ragged, leaned against the counter and looked toward the booth in the corner. His eyes met Keanu's. He didn't ask for help. He didn't have to. Keanu gave the faintest nod, barely perceptible. The storm was almost here. The tension didn't explode. It shifted. A current moved through the room, slow but unmistakable. Something ancient, something primal. Not loud, not sudden, just a quiet ripple of energy that made even the chopsticks still in their holders seem to hesitate. Lee kept talking, oblivious. He turned his back to Mr. Wang again and paced like a performer on stage. "You know what the real joke is," he said, voice dripping with contempt. "This whole idea that respect is earned, that you can just live long enough, keep your head down, and people owe you something. Please. Respect comes from dominance, power, proof. Everything else is just bedtime stories for weak men." He gestured wide to the room as if expecting applause. Instead, silence. But it wasn't fear anymore. It was waiting, because somewhere behind him, Keanu Reeves was no longer seated. He was standing. No chair scrape, no dramatic motion, just standing, still and grounded, like he'd been there all along. The cap still shadowed part of his face, but those near him could now see the set of his jaw, the calm of his eyes. A quiet fire, the kind that didn't need to roar to burn. The nearest table stopped eating, then the one beside it. Slowly, diners began turning, not toward Lee, but toward the man moving at the edge of the room. Keanu stepped forward, once, then again, each step deliberate, silent, a rhythm only the soul could hear. Mr. Wang saw it. His grip on the counter loosened, just a little. Someone near the kitchen whispered something under their breath. Another reached for their phone, but didn't dare raise it. Not yet. Keanu didn't speak until he was halfway across the floor. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, like a string pulled taut between two poles. "You forgot your bill," he said. Lee, still caught in the spotlight of his own ego, laughed without turning. "What?" Keanu took another step. Now he stood just within the outer circle of light, close enough for his presence to command attention, not so close to threaten. "The bill," Keanu said again. "You made a mess. Pay for what you broke." Lee finally turned, slow and exaggerated, his grin wide. "Who are you, the dumpling police?" Laughter spilled from his mouth, forced and sharp. He glanced down at Keanu's plain clothes, faded jacket, jeans, nothing flashy, and waved a dismissive hand. "Mind your business, old man." A few people flinched at the words, not because of what Lee said, but because of what he didn't understand. Keanu's gaze didn't shift. He wasn't provoked. He didn't clench his fists or puff his chest. He just stood there, watching. You shoved a man with a bad shoulder. You spilled hot tea on elders. You called out a master in front of his students. Lee scoffed. "Master? Of what? Tea ceremonies?" Keanu tilted his head. "Of control." The words weren't shouted. They landed like soft thunder, unexpectedly heavy. "You think being loud is strength," Keanu continued. "But strength is knowing when not to use it." He rolled his eyes and cracked his knuckles, suddenly aware that attention was no longer on him. The crowd wasn't watching his bravado anymore. They were watching the man with the calm voice and the still hands. "You know who I am?" Lee snapped. Keanu nodded once. "Yes." "And you're still standing there?" Another nod. "Yes." Lee chuckled, a bitter edge creeping in. "Then you're either stupid or suicidal." "No," Keanu said. "I'm just not afraid of men who talk too much." The air went colder. Lee's eyes narrowed. "You're starting to sound like him," he said, jerking his thumb toward Mr. Wang, who now stood with one hand bracing the edge of the counter. "All that honor and discipline crap?" Keanu stepped closer. "Pick up the bill," he said again. Lee didn't move. Instead, he crossed his arms and sneered. "Or what?" Keanu looked at the overturned chair, the spilled dumplings, the scattered money on the ground. Then he looked at Monsieur Wang, who gave the faintest of nods, subtle but unmistakable. "I won't fight you," Keanu said quietly. Lee smirked. "Smart, but I will stop you." Lee's jaw twitched. Something in the calmness unnerved him more than any threat. He reached out again, this time not toward Mr. Wang, but toward a tray on the nearest table, trying to knock it off in another show of force. But the tray never fell. Keanu moved. A blur. No shout, no wind-up, just a flash of motion, his hand intercepting Lee's wrist with perfect timing and control. The tray stayed upright. Lee's arm locked mid-movement. Keanu didn't squeeze, he didn't twist. He just held it. Still. Powerfully still. Lee tried to pull back. Couldn't. The diners gasped. Not at what they saw, but at what they felt. The storm had shifted. The man who spoke softly now held the room in the palm of his hand. Keanu let go. Lee stumbled back a step, blinking. Angry, confused. But somewhere deep in his posture, the first crack appeared. "You can leave now," Keanu said, voice steady as stone. Lee opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked around the room. No one was with him. Not anymore. Even silence had turned its back on him. The silence after Keanu's final words seemed to stretch longer than it had any right to. "You can leave now." The air inside the Golden Pearl was tight. Lee stood facing Keanu, his jaw clenched, nostrils flared. No one in the restaurant moved. Even the faint clatter of the kitchen had quieted. All that remained was the soft hum of tension, strung between two men like a wire about to snap. Lee blinked and stepped forward. Then he laughed. A loud, forced sound meant for the audience that no longer admired him. "You serious, Grandpa?" Lee said, pointing. "You trying to win with fortune cookie wisdom now?" Keanu didn't blink. "You had 5 seconds," he said, calmly. Lee tilted his head. "What?" 5 seconds to choose a different ending. Lee smirked. "You think you scare me?" Keanu didn't move. "No. I think you're too scared to walk away." The insult hit harder than any shove. Lee's cheeks colored, his pride catching fire. "All right then, movie star. Let's see what you've got." He stepped in fast and swung hard, a wide, spinning kick aimed high toward Keanu's head. The crowd gasped, but Keanu wasn't there. In the space between inhale and exhale, he shifted. He didn't step back. He melted sideways. A small pivot of the foot, a dip of the shoulder. The kick sliced through empty air where Keanu's head had been. Lee staggered slightly from the force of his own momentum. Keanu was behind him now. Still silent. Still calm. Not a single punch thrown. Yet, Lee spun around, furious. "Stand still!" Keanu tilted his head slightly, like a parent studying a tantrum. No anger, just observation. Lee didn't like that. He charged again, this time with a flurry of punches, straight jabs and wild swings meant to overpower and intimidate. But Keanu wasn't a wall. He was a stream. He slipped through the gaps in Lee's motion like water finding its course. A twist of the hip, a lean at the waist, every attack missed by inches, close enough to cause wind, far enough to leave Lee off balance. Each dodge wasn't a retreat. It was a message. Precision, patience. The audience saw it, the beauty of it, not just that Keanu avoided harm, but how. There was no fear in his movement, no aggression either, just pure clarity. Lee snarled and went lower, sweeping at Keanu's legs. Keanu lifted one foot. Perfect timing. Lee hit air again. The motion flowed, unbroken. Keanu's lifted foot came down behind him, stabilizing him into a grounded stance. He didn't even look winded. His breathing remained steady. His hands still hadn't clenched into fists. It was then that Lee's expression changed. He blinked, sweat beading on his brow. He was hitting nothing, fighting ghosts. And the crowd knew it. Lee's shirt clung to his back now, damp with effort. His breath came harder, ragged. Each miss chipped away at his confidence. Each failed strike echoed louder than the last. "You?" he growled, but the words caught in his throat. Keanu stood just out of reach again, one step ahead, eyes clear, posture relaxed. He still hadn't retaliated, not once. No strikes, no blocks, just movement. "You won't even fight?" Lee barked. "What are you afraid of?" Keanu didn't answer with words. Instead, he stepped forward. One quiet, deliberate step that brought him within striking range. Lee flinched. The moment was small, nearly invisible to an untrained eye. But everyone in the restaurant saw it. The proud martial artist had flinched. Not from a blow, from stillness. Keanu held his gaze. "I'm not here to fight you," he said. Lee's fists dropped an inch, confused. "Then what are you?" "Show you," Keanu said quietly, "that fighting isn't always power." Lee lunged forward with a final, desperate push, but Keanu sidestepped again. This time, he let his palm guide Lee's shoulder as he passed, redirecting him into an empty chair. Lee stumbled, fell to one knee. Keanu stood behind him, still untouched. Still unmoved. The diners exhaled. No one clapped. No one spoke. It wasn't that kind of performance. Mr. Wang leaned against the counter, a subtle smile just barely forming behind years of weathered patience. Lee didn't rise right away. He sat on the floor for a moment, blinking at the realization he hadn't landed a single blow, and yet, he was the only one out of breath. "You had 5 seconds," Keanu repeated, now softer. "But you used them on noise." Lee looked up, eyes flickering. "You didn't win," he muttered. Keanu nodded once. Didn't need to. He walked past Lee, toward Mr. Wang, and paused only once to glance at the broken teacup still lying on the floor. He bent, picked it up carefully, and placed it upright on a table. Then, as if the storm had never arrived, he returned to his seat and finished his tea. The message had been delivered, without a punch, without rage, his presence. Lee came at Keanu with renewed fury, fists slicing through the air like blades. He threw a jab, then another, then a hook aimed for Keanu's temple. The strikes were sharp, aggressive, and full of practiced confidence. But confidence without control was like fire without fuel, brief, bright, and doomed to burn out. Keanu didn't step back. He stepped through. He didn't flinch or block. He angled his shoulder just slightly, letting the punch glance off harmlessly. His hand caught Lee's wrist with the lightest pressure, then released it as if it had never been there at all. The movement was so subtle, so precise, that it looked like choreography, but it wasn't rehearsed. It was instinct, refined by decades of practice, pain, and presence. Lee spun, rebalanced, and came again. A sweeping kick, fast, brutal. He meant to end it with one strike. Keanu lowered his center of gravity, pivoted on the ball of his foot, and let the kick slice above him like wind over the ocean. Lee's leg passed, and Keanu's back straightened without effort, already repositioned for the next exchange. Gasps echoed through the restaurant, not because of the fight, but because Keanu hadn't touched him. Not once. But Lee was already sweating. The diners watched as time slowed. Chopsticks paused mid-air. Tea cooled in porcelain cups. Mr. Wang stood behind the counter, one hand pressed to his bandaged arm, the other gently trembling on the edge of a bamboo tray. Lee snarled, furious at the silence, at the way the crowd now looked at him, not in admiration but pity. He shouted and came again, launching into a flurry of jabs meant to overwhelm. But Keanu remained inside the storm. He turned with Lee's momentum, redirected it, let the space between them shrink and expand like breath. Every strike Lee threw landed on absence, not resistance. It was as if Keanu had become air, present but untouchable, and still not one punch thrown. Keanu's face didn't shift, his body didn't bristle. There was no tension in his jaw, no vengeance in his eyes. Only presence, only stillness. Lee's rhythm faltered, his breath shortened. The weight of his limbs began to betray him. For all his years of training, for all the hours in sweaty gyms and padded dojos, no one had ever taught him how to fight a man who didn't fight back. Keanu waited, not for an opening, but for understanding. Lee didn't see it yet, but the lesson had already begun. Lee lunged forward again, this time with desperation behind the motion. His strikes lost their form. His fists no longer sharp, his footing less sure. The precision he'd once flaunted dissolved into frustration. He spun, throwing a backhand meant to catch Keanu off guard. It missed, not because Keanu moved fast, but because he didn't need to. He simply wasn't where Lee thought he would be. It was like trying to strike a reflection in a pool. Every movement stirred the water, but never reached its depth. Keanu stepped lightly to the side, his shoes making no sound against the polished floor. He let Lee pass again, then turned slowly, facing him with the patience of a monk and the balance of a dancer. It wasn't arrogance. It was clarity. Lee blinked sweat from his eyes and backed up a step. Just one. And that step said more than any insult he'd thrown. The diners noticed. So did Mr. Wang. This wasn't a contest anymore. It was a collapse. Keanu's hands remained by his sides, relaxed, open. He had offered no counterattack, no retaliation. Just space. Just time. Time for Lee to burn himself out. Time for the truth to find him. And it was finding him now. Lee hurled one final punch, wild and clumsy. Keanu leaned back just enough to let it pass, then gently pressed two fingers against Lee's extended wrist. Not to strike, but to remind him. That was all it took. The pressure sent Lee off balance. His own force betrayed him, carrying him forward. He stumbled. His knees hit the floor with a sharp thud. His palm landed flat on the wooden boards, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven bursts. He was on the ground. Keanu still hadn't struck him. The restaurant was silent, not in fear, but in reverence. A lesson had been carved into the space between two men, not with fists, but with patience, not with pain, but with poise. Lee looked up slowly, eyes wide. For the first time, he saw Keanu, not as a man, not even as a threat, but as a mirror. And in that mirror, he saw himself. Angry, undisciplined, lost. Keanu extended his hand, not to challenge, but to offer something Lee hadn't expected. Dignity. Lee stared at the hand. His chest rose and fell as the shame settled in. Not because he lost, but because he had never understood what it meant to win. Not really. He had always equated power with dominance, strength with fear, noise with control. But here, now, on the floor of a humble restaurant, a man had defeated him without saying more than 10 words, without throwing a single punch, without needing to prove anything. That was strength. Blay took the hand. Keanu helped him up with ease. No struggle, no punishment, only grace. "You fight like someone who's still looking for something," Keanu said quietly. Lee didn't respond. He couldn't. But his silence wasn't defiance. It was understanding. Mr. Wang stepped forward, holding a small towel to the bruise blooming along his arm. He didn't look at Lee with anger. He nodded once. Slowly. "Respect is not taught with fists," Mr. Wang said gently. "It's earned when you learn to bow without being told." Lee looked at the old man, then at Keanu, then down at his own hands. They were shaking, not from exhaustion, but from awakening. The restaurant remained still. A younger staff member came forward with a cup of water. Lee took it with trembling fingers. He sat on one of the chairs he had earlier kicked aside. No one asked him to leave. He had already left something behind. His pride. Keanu turned back toward his table, where his untouched tea still waited. He sat down again as if nothing had happened, as if the storm had not passed through the room and been swallowed by his silence. Mr. Wang limped toward him, placing a hand briefly on Keanu's shoulder before taking the seat across from him. "You didn't have to," Mr. Wang said softly. "I never do," Keanu replied. A quiet laugh passed between them, the kind shared by old friends who didn't need to say much, to say everything. Across the room, Lee remained seated, elbows on knees, face in his palms. But no one mocked him, no one jeered. The diners returned to their meals, slowly, respectfully. What they'd witnessed wasn't violence. It was restraint. It was mastery. Mr. Wang looked around at the people he had fed for decades, and then back at Keanu. His voice, when he finally spoke again, carried a tremor. Part memory, part gratitude. Used to walk like you once, before the anger." Keanu nodded. "I know. That's why I didn't strike him." Mr. Wang sipped his tea and stared at the corner where Lee now sat, quiet as a boy after his first scolding. "And if he comes back, then he'll walk differently," Keanu said. Mr. Wang smiled, a smile steeped in history, discipline, and the deep relief that some lessons could still be taught without war. And just outside the Golden Pearl, the wind shifted, as if the street itself had taken a breath. Lee staggered back a step, his chest rising and falling with short, frantic breaths. His hair clung to his forehead, damp with sweat. Across from him, Keanu stood still. His hands relaxed, his posture unshaken, his eyes locked not on Lee's fists, but on his heart. He hadn't thrown a single punch, yet he had unraveled Lee with nothing but silence and presence. The restaurant felt suspended in time. Chairs weren't just chairs, they were shields now, hastily pushed between loved ones. Dishes sat cold on tables. Children watched from behind their parents' arms. The air buzzed with something bigger than fear. It was realization. Lee wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and tried to smirk, but it faltered halfway. He circled again, this time slower, unsure of where to strike. Keanu pivoted slightly, not chasing, not retreating, just ready. Lee threw a jab, sloppy and wide. Keanu sidestepped with grace, letting Lee's own momentum carry him off balance. The move was simple, almost gentle, but it spoke louder than any blow. A murmur moved through the diners. Someone whispered, "He's not fighting him, he's teaching him." Mr. Wang, seated now with his injured arm cradled, watched with tired eyes. He had taught martial arts for decades. He knew ego when he saw it. But he also knew something rarer: mercy. What Keanu was doing wasn't a performance. It was restraint in its purest form. And that, he thought, was the truest mastery. Lee swung again, desperate for control. Keanu ducked and stepped back. Not fast, not dramatic, just deliberate. He wasn't trying to win. He was waiting for Lee to understand. By now, the mood had shifted in the restaurant. People weren't just watching a fight, they were witnessing a reckoning. Keanu wasn't there to defeat anyone. He was there to expose what violence never could: the emptiness behind the noise. A waitress leaned close to Carla and whispered, "Who is he really?" Carla just shook her head, eyes wide. "Does it matter?" she said. "Look what he's doing." Near the window, an elderly man stood. Slowly, he helped a frightened child up from under a table and placed a calming hand on her shoulder. Across the room, a mother whispered reassurances to her teenage son, who stared, eyes wide, at the calm figure in the center of the storm. Lee threw one final punch. It missed completely, and he stumbled. Keanu didn't counter. He simply looked at him, steady, quiet, almost sorrowful. Lee was still standing, but something inside him had already fallen. Lee's shoulders dropped ever so slightly. His fists, still clenched, loosened, not because he had surrendered, but because the room no longer gave him permission to act the way he had. He looked around and saw it clearly for the first time. No one was on his side. A woman who'd once admired his strength now shook her head, disappointed. An older man crossed his arms, muttering under his breath. Two teenagers whispered, not in fear, but in ridicule. Not even pity. The strength he thought he had was no longer strength. It was noise. Noise that couldn't hold up under silence. Keanu didn't move to capitalize on the moment. He simply returned to standing beside Mr. Wang. His hands relaxed, his eyes steady. Not smug, not superior, just steady. Mr. Wang took a step forward, his arm still stained with blood, his gait slow from age. But when he stood in front of Lee, something powerful passed between them. Between the man who once taught discipline and the boy who had misunderstood it. Lee opened his mouth to speak, but Mr. Wang lifted his hand gently. A gesture of stillness. A request. Don't speak. Listen. Lee's mouth closed. Keanu watched, unmoving, as Mr. Wang looked Lee straight in the eyes and whispered, "Martial arts were never about control over others." Lee swallowed. Mr. Wang added, "They're about control over yourself." The words hit harder than any punch Keanu could have thrown. Lee lowered his head, and for the first time that day he looked smaller. Not physically, but spiritually. The crowd slowly began to breathe again. It was as if the energy in the room had finally found its rhythm again. Someone picked up a chair and righted it. A staff member gently began sweeping up broken porcelain. A mother hugged her daughter close. And somewhere near the door, a man walked out, not because he was scared, but because he'd seen enough. The storm had passed, but the lesson would linger. Lee didn't speak as he turned his back, stepping over the shattered dishes. For a second, he paused at the doorway, not looking at anyone. He reached for the handle, and it trembled in his grip. He pushed it open and stepped outside into the cold air of evening. The restaurant remained silent. Keanu turned to Mr. Wang. The old man gave a slight nod, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to show gratitude. There was pain in his eyes, but also relief, like something heavy had been lifted. Not just the blow to his arm, but years of carrying the burden of being forgotten, of wondering if what he'd once passed down still mattered. A young man approached from a booth near the window. He'd been watching, unmoving, the whole time. He looked no older than 20, but his eyes held depth. He bowed slightly toward Keanu, then toward Mr. Wang. No words were exchanged, but the meaning was clear. Respect, acknowledgement, willingness to learn. Another boy, then a girl, and finally an older woman followed suit. Quiet nods, silent bows, a soft ripple of honor spreading through the room like sunlight after a storm. Mr. Wang took a breath and sat down slowly. Carla, one of the servers, brought him a glass of water and gently dabbed the blood from his sleeve. He winced, but waved her off kindly. Then Keanu turned, picked up a napkin from the table Lee had crashed into, and set it upright. He began putting the dishes back, piece by piece. Others joined him. It wasn't about cleanup. It was about restoration, about healing. No one spoke for several minutes, not because they didn't have words, but because the silence said everything. Keanu finally walked back to his table. His tea had gone cold, but he didn't seem to mind. He sat quietly, gazing out the window. Mr. Wang glanced at him and smiled, not as a student to a teacher, but as a man to an old friend who hadn't changed after all. Just then, a girl walked up to Keanu's table. She couldn't have been more than 10. She clutched a paper napkin tightly in her hands. "My mom said you're in the movies," she said nervously. Keanu looked at her and smiled gently. "Sometimes," he replied. She handed him the napkin on which she had drawn 2 stick figures. One was standing tall, holding a tray. The other had fallen, but someone was helping him up. Keanu looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. "Thank you," he whispered. As the last shards of porcelain were swept into a dustpan, Mr. Wang stood again. "Tonight," he said softly, "was not about fighting." The room quieted. It was about remembering who we are and what we choose to carry forward. Keanu nodded, eyes glinting. The moment was over, but its weight would stay with them all. Pee-wee's breathing was jagged now. Sweat soaked through his shirt. The sharp sting of failure was beginning to settle into his bones, even as pride screamed for one last shot. His eyes darted around the room. Faces he had once dismissed now watched with quiet focus. But it wasn't pity. It wasn't even fear. It was something else entirely. Reverence. Keanu stood a few feet away, his stance open, not aggressive. He wasn't goading, he wasn't mocking, he was simply present, grounded, watching. His stillness made the chaos feel louder, more ridiculous. Lee snarled, "You think you're better than me?" His voice cracked under the strain. "You think this proves anything?" He didn't wait for an answer. His body surged forward, arms flailing with an uncoordinated punch, legs scrambling to find footing. This wasn't technique anymore. This was instinct, animal panic, a need to win back control of the room, of the narrative, of himself. But Keanu moved like the wind. He stepped aside, guiding Lee's body with a subtle redirection of his shoulder, and with that, Lee crashed headfirst into the bakery display at the far end of the restaurant. The glass shattered with a sickening crack. Sugar-dusted pastries collapsed in on themselves. A ceramic cake stand toppled and hit the floor in pieces. Lee slumped in the wreckage, groaning. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the humming refrigerator behind the counter seemed to hush. Keanu took a slow breath. One step forward, then another. He didn't gloat. His hands weren't clenched in victory. His eyes stayed on Lee, not as a threat, but as a person. Lee tried to stand. His hands trembled, gripping the edge of the counter. His lip was bleeding. His wrist didn't look right. But the most noticeable change wasn't physical. It was in his eyes. That flame of defiance had dimmed. Now there was confusion, doubt, shame. Lee tried to speak, but it caught in his throat. The room waited. His chest heaved. Why didn't you just finish me? Keanu stepped closer, just enough for Lee to hear him clearly. Because that's not what you need. Lee sat slouched among the ruins of the display, breathing shallowly, stunned by how little power he had left. The fight wasn't just over. It had collapsed around him like the glass that now sparkled in the light. A sugar-glazed bun lay crushed beneath his elbow. The smell of cinnamon and powdered sugar filled the air, absurdly at odds with the tension. Across the room, chairs creaked as a few diners cautiously returned to their seats. No one spoke. No one moved toward Lee. There was no sympathy yet, but neither was there contempt. They simply watched him, as if waiting to see who he would become now that the performance was over. Keanu crouched beside him, not out of pity but clarity. His voice was soft. You've spent so long performing pain. You don't recognize healing when it's in front of you. Lee turned his face away, unable to meet his eyes. What do you know about pain? He muttered. Keanu didn't answer right away. He sat beside the broken man on the floor, the scent of pastries still clinging to the air. I know it doesn't make you strong. It only makes you numb. Until you're brave enough to feel it. Lee's jaw tightened. His body trembled slightly, but not from anger this time. His chest rose and fell faster, like someone suppressing something deeper. A memory, a wound, a truth he didn't want to say aloud. My father trained me to win, to dominate. He said weakness was death. He made me fight. Every day, he made me bleed to earn his attention. Keanu's eyes remained steady, unmoved by the confession. Not surprised, just present. And did it work? He asked quietly. Lee didn't answer. His eyes welled up, not from the pain in his ribs or the blood on his knuckles, but from something older, something unspoken. I don't know who I am without the noise, Lee admitted. You're someone who stopped swinging, Keanu replied. That's a start. The door to the kitchen creaked open. Mr. Wang stood just behind it, arms crossed, not with anger, but with something harder to face, forgiveness. His sleeve was still blood-stained, but his posture had changed. He wasn't looking at an enemy anymore. He was looking at a broken student. You should let someone help you now, Keanu said, rising to his feet. Lee nodded once, slowly, as if for the first time in his life he understood what surrender really meant. Not defeat, but release. Keanu extended a hand, and after a long pause, Lee took it. Keanu helped Lee to his feet with a slow, steady pull. There was no applause, no music, no cinematic rise, just silence. A sacred, reverent silence that held more weight than any victory. Lee stood shakily, brushing crumbs from his pants, his expression no longer defiant, just exposed, raw. Mr. Wang stepped forward and placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder, then looked directly at Lee. You disgraced this place, but you didn't destroy it, he said calmly. You can still choose who you become after today. He nodded. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. He lowered his head and turned toward the broken display. Without being asked, he began to clean it. He picked up the shards carefully, one by one, his hands trembling. Customers began to stir again. One elderly man helped a woman back into her seat. Another offered Lee a cloth napkin to wipe his hands. No one shouted. No one cursed. The tension had not vanished, but it had transformed. Keanu stood at the center of it all, no longer a shadow in the corner, but a quiet pillar around which the moment had pivoted. He turned to Mr. Wang, giving him a gentle nod of reassurance. Wang smiled. Not wide, but deeply, and walked back toward the kitchen. As Keanu prepared to leave, a little boy tugged on his jacket sleeve. Are you really Keanu Reeves? The child whispered. Keanu crouched down, smiled warmly, and said, Just a guy who came for tea. The boy beamed. His mother mouthed a quiet "thank you" from across the room. Keanu gave a subtle wave and stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind him. Outside, the sky was darker now, early evening creeping over Chinatown's lantern-lit streets. But inside the Golden Pearl, something had shifted. The illusion that power belonged only to the loudest man in the room had shattered. Along with the glass, the noise, and the ego. Back at the counter, Lee remained, sweeping quietly, eyes misted but steady. In one afternoon, everything he believed about dominance had been unraveled by a man who never raised his voice, who fought without hate, and who walked away without needing to be the hero. The lesson lingered, not in bruises, but in the silence left behind. The sound of shattered glass still hung in the air like dust that hadn't yet settled. Lee lay curled on the floor beside the broken bakery case, clutching his ribs and gasping for breath. The anger in his eyes had vanished, replaced with disbelief and shame. His power had unraveled not with force, but through humiliation, silence, and grace. He wasn't a warrior. He was just loud. Keanu stood a few feet away, unmoved, breathing steadily, his stance relaxed. There was no gloating in his posture, no triumph, just calm. The diners were still frozen, the tension not fully gone, but beginning to loosen its grip. Keanu looked around, meeting no one's gaze in particular. Then his eyes settled on Mr. Wang. The old man had pushed himself upright, using the counter for support, his sleeve still stained from earlier, his hands trembling slightly from the shock more than pain. But his eyes were proud. Tired, but proud. Keanu stepped forward, not toward Lee, but toward Mr. Wang. With slow precision, he picked up a clean towel from the service shelf and gently offered it. "You all right?" Keanu asked softly. Mr. Wang nodded, his voice caught in his throat. He accepted the towel, pressing it to his bleeding elbow, and gave a short, quiet laugh that broke the silence like the first drop of rain after a drought. "You always did know when to show up," he said. Behind them, a whisper rose from a teenager seated near the kitchen. "That's John Wick." Another voice followed. "No way." A woman clutched her purse to her chest. "He's real?" But Keanu ignored the whispers. He reached out his hand. Not to shake, not to intimidate, but to help. He extended it toward Lee, who was still curled on the floor, ashamed and stunned. For a long moment, Lee just stared at the hand. He didn't take it. Keanu didn't flinch. He simply lowered his arm and turned back to Mr. Wang, now gently guiding him toward a nearby chair. Once seated, Keanu knelt and began wrapping the towel around Wang's elbow in careful layers. The moment was quiet, reverent. One of the cooks emerged from the kitchen, eyes wide. "Should I call the cops?" Keanu looked up and shook his head once. "He's done." Lee didn't argue. He hadn't moved. The mask of power had cracked, and in its place was a boy who had finally seen the truth. The sound of chairs gently scraping the floor followed as patrons began rising from their tables. Some moved cautiously to the back of the restaurant. Others approached with hushed voices, unsure if it was safe to speak. But the danger had passed. The storm had blown through, and all that remained now was the quiet work of putting things back in place. One older gentleman, maybe in his 70s, stepped forward with a gentle nod toward Mr. Wang. "You all right, old friend?" Mr. Wang gave a tired smile. "I've seen worse. Just never expected it here." Keanu finished tying off the towel and stood. His hands were steady, his presence still composed. "Places like this," Keanu said softly, "they matter." He wasn't speaking to the room, he was speaking to himself, but the room heard. A waitress began collecting broken plates from the floor. A teenager grabbed a dustpan from behind the counter. Slowly, the restaurant began to breathe again. Not because someone told them it was okay, but because they saw who had made it okay. Lee remained on the ground, not speaking, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. His expression had shifted from rage to confusion, as if for the first time he didn't know who he was. A little girl, no older than 6, clung to her father's pant leg as she stared at Keanu. "Daddy, is he a superhero?" The father knelt and whispered something like that. Keanu turned and gave her the smallest nod. Not a wink, not a smile, just a quiet moment of recognition that seemed to settle something in the room. Mr. Wang, now seated and recovering, glanced toward the shattered display case. "That was May's work," he said with a sigh. "She spent all morning arranging it." Keanu looked over at the mess. "I'll pay for the damage." "You already did more than that," Mr. Wang replied. "You reminded people who we are." From the back, Carla, the diner's oldest waitress, spoke up. "And what we're not." The message hung there. The crowd understood. It wasn't about the violence. It never had been. It was about what had been protected: dignity, safety, peace. Keanu walked toward the kitchen, nodded to the cook, and quietly asked for 2 bags of ice. One for Mr. Wang's elbow, one for Lee. He returned and handed one of the bags to Wang. Then, without saying a word, he placed the second bag near Lee's hand. He didn't look for thanks. He didn't expect it. He just made sure it was there. Lee didn't move right away. His fingers twitched beside the bag of ice like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to take it. A moment later, he reached for it with trembling hands. Not to reject it, but to accept it, quietly, shamefully, and with something new behind his eyes. Mr. Wang leaned back in his chair, his breath still a little shaky. He studied Lee, then looked up at Keanu. "Why didn't you fight him back harder?" he asked. Keanu knelt beside Wang and spoke in a low voice. "Because he wasn't trying to win. He was trying to be seen." That struck something deep in the old man. He nodded slowly. Then, to no one in particular, he murmured, "That kind of pain. It's loud when it has nowhere to go." The diners began returning to their meals, quieter now, more reflective. The air had changed. The Golden Pearl wasn't just a restaurant again. It was a sanctuary, a place where people had witnessed something rare, not just strength, but restraint. Not just silence, but intention. A police officer finally entered the restaurant, called by someone during the commotion. She took one look around, paused, and walked up to Keanu. "Everything okay here?" Keanu glanced at Mr. Wang, who gave a nod. Then Keanu turned back and said, "Handled." The officer looked at Lee, still crouched and holding the ice to his ribs. She didn't ask questions, just said, "Let us know if you need a report." Then she left. Keanu stood beside Mr. Wang once more. "Let me know what else you need." Mr. Wang smiled. "I just need one more thing." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "A promise that you'll stop sneaking in here like a ghost. Just say hello next time." Keanu finally smiled. "Deal." He helped Mr. Wang up and handed him his cane. Then he walked to the door, pausing only once to glance back. Lee was still sitting, still quiet, maybe thinking, maybe changed. Keanu didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. He just needed to know that tonight a good man's dignity was preserved, that a place built on respect and memory hadn't been broken. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped out into the night, the city lights catching the brim of his cap as he disappeared into the dark. The storm had passed, but its meaning would linger. Keanu stood in the center of the restaurant, silent and composed. The only sound was the distant rattle of a spoon rolling across the floor. Glass shards still glinted near the shattered bakery display. Lee, hunched and trembling, remained slumped near the wreckage, surrounded not by enemies, but by his own defeated ego. The fight had ended minutes ago, but the emotional weight lingered. It wasn't just pain etched into his face, it was realization. Keanu walked over to the door. No triumph in his step, no boast in his posture. He reached out, turned the handle, and pushed the door open. The late afternoon sunlight poured in, cutting a quiet line across the floor. He looked over his shoulder, not at the diners, not at Mr. Wang, but at Lee. The moment hung in silence. Lee hesitated, one hand clutching his side. His chest heaved, as if trying to push out the shame choking him. For a split second, he looked up at Keanu, expecting judgment. But what he saw instead was something far more crushing. Mercy. No lectures, no mockery, just an open door. Lee dragged himself to his feet, legs unsteady, pride in pieces. With each step, the weight of his own actions seemed heavier. He passed Keanu without a word. Keanu simply held the door. Lee limped into the alley, disappearing into the light. Then came the soft sound of the door closing. Not slammed, just a quiet, final click. Inside, the restaurant seemed to release a collective breath. A tension so tightly wound for so long began to loosen. Plates were still broken, tables still overturned. But something deeper had shifted. It wasn't just a physical fight that had ended. It was a spiritual one. Mr. Wang, still seated with the cloth wrapped around his bleeding arm, looked over at Keanu. Their eyes met. A long silence passed between them. Nothing needed to be said. The years of history between them spoke louder than words ever could. Keanu bent down and picked up a chair. He set it upright gently and moved to the next. Across the room, others began doing the same. A teenage boy helped his mother sweep up glass. A couple in their 60s gathered fallen napkins from the floor. The spell had broken. Not in a flash, but like dawn rising. Slow, steady, inevitable. The golden pearl had changed. Not because it was damaged, but because it had been defended. By a man who never raised his voice. By a presence that stood tall not through violence, but restraint. By humility, not ego. And that, more than anything else, was what the diners would remember. The restaurant wasn't quiet out of fear anymore. It was quiet out of respect. Carla, the young hostess, emerged from the kitchen holding a mop and a bucket. She paused when she saw Keanu wiping down a table with a folded cloth. For a second, she just stared. She had seen him before, in movies, in magazine spreads. But now, seeing him like this, sleeves rolled up, clearing dishes like any other man, was something else entirely. She joined him wordlessly, setting the mop against the floor and pushing it gently across the stained tile. At the far end, Mr. Wang tried to stand, but Keanu reached him first and knelt beside him. "You shouldn't lift anything," Keanu said quietly. Wang shook his head, stubborn even in pain. "It's still my place." "And it always will be," Keanu replied, tightening the cloth wrap on Wang's forearm. People watched the interaction closely. Not because it was flashy or loud, but because it felt like truth. No PR cameras, no headlines, just a man showing up for a friend when it mattered most. A young man with an apron came forward, holding a broom. "Mr. Wang," he said nervously, "I want to help. Permanently. If you'll let me, I'd like to start apprenticing here." Wang blinked, then nodded. Keanu smiled faintly, catching the moment. At the bar, a woman who'd been crying earlier now held her daughter's hand. The girl whispered, "Mom, is he really John Wick?" The mother nodded slowly. "Yes, sweetheart, but today he was something even better." Another regular approached Keanu, a middle-aged man in a mechanic's uniform. "You didn't have to do that, sir. Most folks would have walked away." Keanu looked up from where he was aligning a bent chair leg. "Some places are worth staying for." That sentence traveled. Through the room. Through hearts. Through the unspoken pain that had simmered beneath the surface of a community too used to being overlooked. Outside, Lee had long vanished into the city streets. But inside, the repair had already begun. Not just of shattered glass, but of spirit. Mr. Wang rested against the wall now, holding a warm towel someone had brought him. Keanu stood by his side, not like a celebrity, not like a hero, but like a brother in arms. an old student, still honoring the teacher. "I never expected you'd show up today," Wang muttered. "I didn't plan to," Keanu replied, "but something told me I should." Wang smiled with tired eyes. Then maybe the universe finally paid attention. The Golden Pearl would close for the evening soon, but it wouldn't close broken. It would close renewed. And every chair they reset, every dish they swept away, would carry the weight of a story that would ripple far beyond Chinatown. And it had only just begun. Keanu moved toward the back counter, where a photo frame had fallen in the chaos. He gently picked it up, brushing away splinters of glass. Inside was a black and white picture of a much younger Mr. Wang, standing outside the original Golden Pearl in Hong Kong, beaming beside his martial arts students. Keanu studied it for a moment, then carefully set the frame upright, even though the glass was cracked. Wang approached beside him, favoring one side, and saw what Keanu was looking at. "Those boys," Wang said quietly. "Some became fighters. One became a movie star." Keanu chuckled softly. "Only because you taught me how to fall." Wang tapped the picture, and more importantly, how to get back up. There was a moment of silence between them, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Then Carla came forward again, holding out a tray of tea. "It's not much, but I thought, maybe we could all sit for a minute?" Everyone who remained nodded. Chairs were pulled close. Tea was poured. A circle of strangers, bound by something rare. A shared moment of truth. No one asked for autographs. No one pulled out their phone. Keanu sipped slowly, eyes scanning the faces. He spoke gently. "What happened here today wasn't about a fight. It was about memory, dignity, and standing up when someone tries to take that away from you." Carlo looked at Wang. "You taught us that before. We just forgot." Wang nodded. "And now we remember." Outside, the city moved on, buses rumbling, horns honking, life continuing without pause. But inside the Golden Pearl, time held still. A few minutes later, Keanu stood. He reached into his pocket and left something on the counter, a small black notebook with frayed edges. "For the next generation," he said to Wang, "it's yours now." Wang looked at it curiously but didn't open it, not yet. As Keanu walked toward the door, he passed each table slowly, as if taking in the story one last time. Then he reached the entrance, paused, and held the door open once more, not for anyone else this time, but for memory itself to walk out with him. The door closed behind him with a soft finality. But it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a promise. A promise that the Golden Pearl would never be just a restaurant again. It would be remembered as the place where humility stood tall, where silence spoke louder than fists, where one man reminded everyone that true strength doesn't need applause. And as chairs scraped gently against the floor and the staff returned to cleaning, one phrase echoed in every corner of the room. Wilhelm didn't just protect us. He changed us. In the days that followed, the Golden Pearl slowly reopened its heart to the community. The shattered glass from the bakery display had been swept away, but what lingered was something deeper, an invisible ripple of protection and dignity. No sign went up, no announcements were made, but the regulars returned. First came the Chen family, who always ordered the hot pot and sat near the window. They didn't mention the fight. They just smiled at Mr. Wang as they placed their order, gently asking how his arm was healing. Then came Mrs. Yamamoto, who had stayed away for months after a string of unsettling encounters near the alley. She walked in, placed her bag neatly on the table, and whispered, "Feels safe again." Mr. Wang, his arm still wrapped in cloth, offered everyone the same quiet nod. He didn't dwell on what happened. He simply served the dishes with the same precision he always had, his hands steady despite the bruises. The chaos had passed, but it left behind a hum of reverence, the kind that doesn't come from victory, but from survival. Nobody mentioned Keanu Reeves by name. No one needed to. The story wasn't about him. It was about what he had restored. There were no cell phone videos, no viral clips. Not a single customer had filmed what happened that night. In a world obsessed with exposure, this moment remained untouched, living only in the memories of those who had witnessed it. It became a story passed from mouth to mouth, over teacups and dim sum platters, in the rhythm of whispered conversations. The cook in the back, a teenager named Min, started showing up early. He wanted to learn more than recipes. He began observing Mr. Wang's every movement, how he greeted each guest, how he kept the energy of the room calm. One morning, Mr. Wang handed Min a fresh apron and said, "Respect is a recipe too." The restaurant's walls, still worn with age, held the silence with grace. And inside that silence, a quiet strength bloomed. Outside, the alley remained unchanged. The same cracked pavement, the same rusted fire escape. But locals who passed through it now moved slower. Some even paused. It wasn't about fear. It was about what had been proven. That kindness didn't mean weakness. That humility didn't mean invisibility. That someone could protect without ever raising their voice. Keanu never returned for applause. He didn't need to. The echo of that night lived on, not as a tale of violence, but as a parable of restraint, of presence, of what it means to show up when it matters most. And in the heart of Chinatown, the Golden Pearl wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a sanctuary. By the second week, Mr. Wang's rhythm had returned. His limp faded, his posture straightened. But his eyes, those had changed. They carried more weight now, not from trauma, but from the pride of having survived something that tried to humiliate everything he stood for. A framed photo appeared on the wall near the kitchen. It wasn't of Keanu or the fight. It was an old picture. Mr. Wang in his youth, teaching children martial arts in a dusty park. The photo had faded edges, but the spirit in it was unmistakable. Underneath it, a small plaque read, "Strength lives in stillness." Some noticed the photo and smiled. Others paused and bowed their heads. No one asked why it was there. They understood. Across town, other shopkeepers began dropping by with care packages. An old florist brought jasmine for the entryway. A baker delivered hand-twisted sesame buns. The neighborhood, once fragmented by fear and exhaustion, started mending, one gesture at a time. Not out of obligation, but because they finally had an anchor. There was something else, too, something unspoken. The parents of teenagers who had once loitered outside now encouraged their kids to apply for weekend jobs at the Pearl. The restaurant, once just another place to eat, became a symbol of earned respect. And in a small booth near the back, Min started keeping a notepad. He wasn't just learning recipes, he was writing down things Mr. Wang said in passing. Phrases like, "Peace doesn't beg to be noticed," and "Your posture tells the room who you are." To Min, these were lessons. To the regulars, they were gospel. Mr. Wang never talked about that night, but the stories spread anyway. Not the kind with punches and kicks, the kind that reached deeper. Stories about a man who didn't fight until it was necessary, who protected an elder not with rage, but with clarity, who disappeared just as quietly as he arrived. In time, the regulars started telling visitors about the silent night. A mother shared it with her daughter while stirring noodles. An elder recited it over a chess game. No two versions were exactly alike, but the essence was always the same. One man stood up, not for glory, but for grace. And the man himself? Keanu was never seen again in Chinatown, but he was never forgotten. In fact, the absence made the presence more powerful. It gave the story room to grow into a fable, a teaching, a quiet reminder that dignity is the strongest stance of all. The restaurant walls didn't just hold in sound anymore, they held memory. One afternoon, a young woman named Alice stepped into the Golden Pearl with her 6-year-old son. She'd heard whispers from her aunt about a place where people still remember how to treat each other. She wasn't from the neighborhood, but she had come because she needed to believe in that kind of place. She ordered quietly, unsure. Mr. Wang brought over their food himself, placing the child's plate gently, like he was setting down something sacred. When she offered to pay up front, he just smiled and said, "First-time guests eat first, then decide." Alice blinked back tears. She'd forgotten how kindness could feel like a shock. Later, when she asked the waiter if the stories about that night were true, he didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed to the plaque on the wall. "Strength lives in stillness," it read. She didn't ask anything more. She didn't need to. The story lived there, in the silence between table laughter, in the way chairs were pushed in carefully, in the way everyone looked up when the door opened. Not in fear, but in welcome. The legacy of what happened wasn't recorded in ink or video. It was etched in behavior, passed on through tone, gesture, presence. Word eventually reached a martial arts school across the city. Their head instructor, a calm and thoughtful man named Mr. Kim, brought a small group of students one night to eat. He didn't say why, but before they left, he asked to meet Mr. Wang and simply said, "Thank you for showing them." Wang nodded, eyes soft but sharp. "They already know," he said. "Now they've just seen." The true legacy wasn't the fight. It was the change that came after, the way the community began to speak softer but stand taller, the way people handled conflict, with patience, with pause, not because they feared violence, but because they had seen strength expressed another way. A local high school student wrote an essay about it for a city scholarship. She titled it, "The Night the Room Breathed Again." She didn't mention Keanu by name. She didn't need to. Everyone reading it knew exactly who she meant. And in a quiet corner booth, every Sunday at 3 p.m., Mr. Wang resumed teaching again. Just 3 students at first. No uniforms, no belts. Just breath, stance, and silence. He called it movement class, but what he taught wasn't about kicking or blocking. It was about knowing when not to move, when to be still, when to listen. The Golden Pearl became more than a restaurant. It became a reminder that some of the strongest people in the world don't raise their voices, they raise the room. And through it all, Keanu's name was never displayed, not on a plaque, not on a wall. Only remembered where it mattered, inside the hearts of the people he helped. And sometimes, that's the only kind of legacy that lasts. A soft breeze rustled the faded awning of the Golden Pearl as Keanu stepped through the entrance. It had been a month since the incident, but the place still carried its quiet magic. Tables were back in place. The broken glass was long swept away. The scar on the bakery counter had been polished into something resembling character, not damage. Mr. Wang was seated alone at a side table, a small pot of jasmine tea steeping beside him. He looked older, perhaps from the healing rather than the years. His left arm rested in a supportive sling, but his eyes were as steady as ever. Keanu approached silently, no fanfare, no entourage, just the familiar, respectful nod between 2 men who'd walked difficult paths. Without a word, Wang poured a cup of tea and slid it toward the empty seat across from him. Keanu sat. For a few moments they said nothing, only the sound of teacaps meeting saucers and the distant clink of a pan in the kitchen interrupted the stillness. "I didn't think you'd come back so soon," Wang finally said. "I never really left," Keanu replied, his voice low, measured. "Some things just take time to circle back." Wang gave a quiet chuckle, still as poetic as ever. They drank in companionable silence before Keanu leaned back slightly and looked around the restaurant. "I remember the first day you opened this place," he said. "You wore that red apron that didn't match anything, and burned the first 5 dumplings because you were too busy shaking hands. Wang smirked. I was nervous. Cooking was never my strength. No, Keanu said with a faint smile. But you made people feel like they mattered. That was the strength. The air grew a little heavier, not with tension, but with history. There was something deeper in this return than just a visit. I never got to say thank you, Keanu said, his gaze steady. For teaching me before anyone else believed in me. Wang's eyebrows lifted slightly. That was a long time ago. It wasn't for movies, Keanu continued. It wasn't for stunts. It was for control, for respect. You didn't just show me how to block a punch. You showed me how to carry silence. Wang looked down into his tea and nodded. The old ways. Not many remember those anymore. They saved me, Keanu said. When everything else got loud, what you taught gave me quiet. A few regulars filtered in, offering small nods and discreet glances at the man in the cap. But no one approached. The energy was sacred, the kind of moment that needed no explanation. Wang sighed softly. That fight last month, it wasn't about fists. No, Keanu said, his eyes still on the tea. It was about fear and how not to pass it on. Mr. Wang let the words settle. The hum of the restaurant faded behind the sound of memory. He looked at Keanu, this man who had once stood in his small backyard with scraped knuckles and something to prove. Not to the world, but to himself. You were 17, Wang said, voice quiet. Didn't even knock, just bowed at the gate and asked to learn. I didn't know what I was asking, Keanu replied, lips curving slightly. But I knew you were someone who could teach it. I almost said no, Wang admitted. Not because I didn't think you could handle it, but because I didn't want to be responsible for what you'd become. Keanu tilted his head. What changed? You stayed after practice one night. My wife had fallen asleep in the kitchen. You swept the whole courtyard without being asked. Quietly, carefully, like it mattered. That's when I knew you weren't just hungry for skill, you were hungry for stillness. Keanu looked down, moved by the recollection. I was angry back then, not at anyone in particular, just untethered. Wang nodded. Most fighters are, until they learn the difference between rage and rhythm. The tea had cooled slightly, but neither of them reached for it. The conversation itself was the warmth now. I watched what happened in here last month, Wang said, finally breaking the silence. You didn't hit him until you had to. You let him exhaust his own fire. It wasn't the enemy, Keanu said. Just someone who never learned what you taught me. How to lose with grace before losing with violence. Wang leaned forward, his old eyes sharp. You moved like mist, but you planted roots. Everyone who saw that day, they won't forget. You turned a fight into a mirror. That was the lesson, wasn't it? Keanu asked. Not how to win, but how to endure without becoming what you resist. The words floated between them, sinking deep into the walls of the Golden Pearl. It wasn't a restaurant anymore, not just. It was a temple of memory, a dojo of discipline built with soup and tea instead of mats and gloves. Wang gestured to the small scroll hanging above the kitchen door. The characters were faded, but Keanu read them instantly. Strength without noise, he said aloud. That's what you brought back here, Wang said. Not fame, not fortune, just presence. Keanu finally took another sip of his tea, the jasmine now cool but fragrant. I owed you more than a fight, he said. I owed you remembrance. Then remember this too, Wang replied, setting his cup down. You didn't win because you're fast or strong. You won because you waited. And in that waiting, you gave that man a chance to choose something else. Keanu met his eyes. Maybe next time he will. Mr. Wang nodded slowly, the lines on his face deepening with quiet thought. The weight of their conversation hung like incense in the air, unseen but impossible to ignore. Keanu rose from his chair and walked toward the back of the restaurant. There, mounted on the wall beside the storeroom door, was a faded black and white photo. He paused in front of it. Two young men stood side by side, Wang in his prime, fists raised, and beside him, a much younger Keanu, fresh-faced and focused. Neither smiled. Both had eyes that had already seen too much. Keanu raised his hand and gently touched the corner of the frame. "I used to think strength came from knowing how to fight," he said without turning. "But now I think it comes from knowing when to stop." Wang approached slowly and stood beside him. "You are always meant to learn that. Some people need a stage, others need silence. You found both." They walked back to the tea table, the clink of porcelain grounding them once more. The restaurant had reopened for the day, but the world outside hadn't yet spilled in. It was still just them, two men bonded by time, bound by respect. Wang lifted the teapot and poured a fresh cup for Keanu. "You said you learned discipline," he said, "but what did you do with it all these years?" Keanu looked down, thoughtful. "I used it to survive, and later I used it to choose what scripts to take, what people to trust, what moments to be silent." Wang raised an eyebrow. "And this moment?" Keanu smiled faintly. "This one. I wanted to be present, that's all." There was a pause, long and reverent. "You know," Wang said, "when you were 17, I told my wife that you weren't meant for violence. She didn't believe me." Keanu chuckled under his breath. "She was probably right." Wang shrugged. "Maybe. But now I know you weren't meant to hurt. You were meant to heal." Keanu looked up, eyes soft. "Thank you. For everything. For not giving up on that kid with raw fists and a broken heart." Wang raised his teacup in salute. "And thank you for coming back, for reminding me that even after all these years, a lesson once planted can still bloom." They toasted without words, only the quiet clink of two porcelain cups marking the moment. Outside, the early sun filtered through paper lanterns and touched the street with gold. Keanu stood, bowed low, and headed for the door. Before stepping out, he turned one last time. "No more fear," he said. "Not here." Wang didn't respond with words. He simply nodded once, deep and steady. The door opened. The wind carried Keanu out into the day. The warrior had returned, not to conquer, but to honor. A soft breeze rustled the faded awning of the Golden Pearl as Keanu stepped through the entrance. It had been a month since the incident, but the place still carried its quiet magic. Tables were back in place. The broken glass was long swept away. The scar on the bakery counter had been polished into something resembling character, not damage. Mr. Wang was seated alone at a side table, a small pot of jasmine tea steeping beside him. He looked older, perhaps from the healing rather than the years. His left arm rested in a supportive sling, but his eyes were as steady as ever. Keanu approached silently, no fanfare, no entourage, just the familiar, respectful nod between two men who'd walked difficult paths. Without a word, Wang poured a cup of tea and slid it toward the empty seat across from him. Keanu sat. For a few moments they said nothing. Only the sound of teacups meeting saucers and the distant clink of a pan in the kitchen interrupted the stillness. "I didn't think you'd come back so soon," Wang finally said. "I never really left," Keanu replied, his voice low, measured. "Some things just take time to circle back." Wang gave a quiet chuckle. Still as poetic as ever. They drank in companionable silence before Keanu leaned back slightly and looked around the restaurant. "I remember the first day you opened this place," he said. "You wore that red apron that didn't match anything and burned the first 5 dumplings because you were too busy shaking hands." Wang smirked. "I was nervous. Cooking was never my strength." "No," Keanu said with a faint smile. "But you made people feel like they mattered. That was the strength." The air grew a little heavier. not with tension, but with history. There was something deeper in this return than just a visit. "I never got to say thank you," Keanu said, his gaze steady, "for teaching me before anyone else believed in me." Wang's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That was a long time ago. It wasn't for movies," Keanu continued. "It wasn't for stunts. It was for control, for respect. You didn't just show me how to block a punch. You showed me how to carry silence." Wang looked down into his tea and nodded. "The old ways. Not many remember those anymore." "They saved me," Keanu said. "When everything else got loud, what you taught gave me quiet." A few regulars filtered in, offering small nods and discreet glances at the man in the cap, but no one approached. The energy was sacred, the kind of moment that needed no explanation. Wang sighed softly. "That fight last month, it wasn't about fists." "No," Keanu said, his eyes still on the tea. "It was about fear, and how not to pass it on." Mr. Wang let the words settle. The hum of the restaurant faded behind the sound of memory. He looked at Keanu, this man who had once stood in his small backyard with scraped knuckles and something to prove, not to the world, but to himself. "You were 17, Wang said, voice quiet. "Didn't even knock, just bowed at the gate and asked to learn." "I didn't know what I was asking," Keanu replied, lips curving slightly, "but I knew you were someone who could teach it." "I almost said no," Wang admitted, "not because I didn't think you could handle it, but because I didn't want to be responsible for what you'd become." Keanu tilted his head. "What changed?" "You stayed after practice one night. My wife had fallen asleep in the kitchen. You swept the whole courtyard without being asked, quietly, carefully, like it mattered. That's when I knew you weren't just hungry for skill, you were hungry for stillness." Keanu looked down, moved by the recollection. "I was angry back then, not at anyone in particular, just untethered." Wang nodded. "Most fighters are, until they learn the difference between rage and rhythm." The tea had cooled slightly, but neither of them reached for it. The conversation itself was the warmth now. "I watched what happened in here last month," Wang said, finally breaking the silence. "You didn't hit him until you had to. You let him exhaust his own fire." "Bocaroni wasn't the enemy," Keanu said, "just someone who never learned what you taught me. How to lose with grace before losing with violence." Wang leaned forward, his old eyes sharp. "You moved like mist, but you planted roots. Everyone who saw that day, they won't forget. You turned a fight into a mirror." "That was the lesson, wasn't it?" Keanu asked. "Not how to win, but how to endure without becoming what you resist." The words floated between them, sinking deep into the walls of the Golden Pearl. It wasn't a restaurant anymore, not just. It was a temple of memory, a dojo of discipline built with soup and tea instead of mats and gloves. Wang gestured to the small scroll hanging above the kitchen door. The characters were faded, but Keanu read them instantly. "Strength without noise," he said aloud. "That's what you brought back here," Wang said. "Not fame, not fortune, just presence." Keanu finally took another sip of his tea, the jasmine now cool but fragrant. "I owed you more than a fight," he said. "I owed you remembrance." "Then remember this too," Wang replied, setting his cup down. "You didn't win because you're fast or strong. You won because you waited. And in that waiting, you gave that man a chance to choose something else." Keanu met his eyes. "Maybe next time he will." Mr. Wang nodded slowly, the lines on his face deepening with quiet thought. The weight of their conversation hung like incense in the air, unseen, but impossible to ignore. Keanu rose from his chair and walked toward the back of the restaurant. There, mounted on the wall beside the storeroom door, was a faded black and white photo. He paused in front of it. Two young men stood side by side, Wang in his prime, fists raised, and beside him, a much younger Keanu, fresh-faced and focused. Neither smiled. Both had eyes that had already seen too much. Keanu raised his hand and gently touched the corner of the frame. "I used to think strength came from knowing how to fight," he said without turning. "But now I think it comes from knowing when to stop." Wang approached slowly and stood beside him. "You were always meant to learn that. Some people need a stage, others need silence. You found both." They walked back to the tea table, the clink of porcelain grounding them once more. The restaurant had reopened for the day, but the world outside hadn't yet spilled in. It was still just them. Two men, bonded by time, bound by respect. Wang lifted the teapot and poured a fresh cup for Keanu. "You said you learned discipline," he said, "but what did you do with it all these years?" Keanu looked down, thoughtful. "I used it to survive. And later I used it to choose. What scripts to take, what people to trust, what moments to be silent." Wang raised an eyebrow. "And this moment?" Keanu smiled faintly. "This one, I wanted to be present, that's all." There was a pause, long and reverent. "You know," Wang said, "when you were 17, I told my wife that you weren't meant for violence. She didn't believe me." Keanu chuckled under his breath. "She was probably right." Wang shrugged. "Maybe. But now I know you weren't meant to hurt. You were meant to heal." Keanu looked up, eyes soft. "Thank you. For everything. For not giving up on that kid with raw fists and a broken heart." Wang raised his teacup in salute. "And thank you for coming back. For reminding me that even after all these years, a lesson once planted can still bloom." They toasted without words, only the quiet clink of two porcelain cups marking the moment. Outside, the early sun filtered through paper lanterns and touched the street with gold. Keanu stood, bowed low, and headed for the door. Before stepping out, he turned one last time. "No more fear," he said. "Not here." Wang didn't respond with words. He simply nodded once, deep and steady. The door opened. The wind carried Keanu out into the day. The warrior had returned, not to conquer, but to honor. It started with a whisper, not from the crowd that night, but from a neighbor who had heard about what happened inside the Golden Pearl. A quiet rumor, passed from a barber to a grocer, from a school teacher to a retired tailor. Each one told it a little differently, but they all agreed on one thing: something important had taken place. A week later, a young reporter named Mei Lin walked through the red archway into Chinatown, camera slung over her shoulder and notebook in hand. She wasn't from the area, but the story had reached her desk like a dropped pin with no coordinates. All she had was a one-line tip: ask what happened at the Golden Pearl. She found the restaurant tucked between a bookstore and a pharmacy, modest and welcoming. The door chimed when she entered. The place was calm, full of steam and broth, clinking teacups, and the smell of jasmine rice. Mr. Wang was behind the counter, moving a bit slower than usual, but smiling as always. Mei approached the counter with quiet confidence and introduced herself. Mr. Wang nodded politely and offered her a seat. She asked him what happened the previous month. He gave her tea. She tried again. "There was an incident, wasn't there? Something unusual?" Mr. Wang tilted his head slightly and replied, "We serve food. People come hungry, they leave full." She smiled, not pushing too hard. "I heard an actor, Keanu Reeves, was here." He poured more tea. Lots of people passed through. Mei stayed a while, speaking to a few regulars. One elderly man remembered a scuffle. Another said something about broken glass. A waitress mentioned cleaning up some spilled soup and shattered plates, but no one offered detail. No one gave her what she came for, not because they were scared, but because what happened wasn't about headlines. Even when she left her business card behind, no one called her. That night, she sat in her studio apartment downtown, staring at a half-empty notebook. She could have written a speculative piece, something flashy or filled with questions. Instead, she chose restraint. She titled the article, "Actor Protects Chinatown Restaurant." It was short, barely 300 words. No quotes, no images. Just a mention of an anonymous altercation, a peaceful resolution, and an actor seen cleaning up broken chopsticks with the staff. It didn't go viral, it didn't trend, but in Chinatown, the article made it to the bulletin board inside the Golden Pearl. Mr. Wang pinned it between a coupon for dumplings and a flyer for martial arts classes. He read it once, nodded, and never spoke of it again. Because the real story wasn't in the ink, it lived in the silence. In the fact that a place, once shaken, had steadied itself again. That strength had arrived without asking for applause. That a man known for action came not to act, but to remind everyone of what it meant to stand still and protect. A week after May's article was quietly published, something curious began happening. Patrons who had not set foot in the Golden Pearl for months slowly returned, not because of the article, but because they heard, in voices more trusted than ink, that something sacred had happened inside those walls. One by one, families came back. Some brought their children. Others brought old photos of the place from 20 years ago when Mr. Wang was still teaching Tai Chi in the alley behind the restaurant. Some brought nothing at all, except a quiet hunger and a desire to be in a space that now felt different. It wasn't the food that had changed. The dumplings were still just as handmade, the soup still steamed in the same ceramic bowls. It was the feeling, the unspoken warmth in the air, like walking into a home that had weathered a storm and come out stronger. People began speaking more softly at their tables, not out of fear, but reverence. One couple who had witnessed the incident sat near the window one evening, holding hands. The husband whispered, "You think that was really him?" His wife looked around, her eyes on the small tea set still displayed behind the counter. Does it matter? They both knew it did, but not for the reason others might assume. It wasn't about celebrity or spectacle. It was about something deeper. A reminder that real courage didn't need to announce itself, that someone who could have used force to destroy instead used discipline to restore. Meanwhile, Mr. Wang continued his work with the same rhythm as always, but he walked taller now, not because he had been defended, but because he had been believed. That mattered more than anything. No one treated him as fragile anymore. If anything, the community began looking to him for quiet wisdom. The neighborhood council even approached him to speak at a local safety event, but he politely declined. He didn't want to speak on stages. He wanted to keep the peace in the corners, where cameras didn't reach. He told them, "It's not the microphone that brings safety. It's the people who stay when no one is watching." A few days later, someone left a folded note on the counter. Inside was a short message. "Thank you for showing us the kind of strength that heals." There was no signature. Wang kept it in the drawer beneath the register. That Sunday, during the mid-afternoon lull between lunch and dinner, a group of young boys from the nearby community center came in, still in their practice uniforms. They asked if the rumors were true. Mr. Wang just smiled and brought out a tray of sesame buns. He sat with them, asked about school, about their families. When one of them shyly asked what martial arts was really for, Wang said, "To protect the parts of life that..." It was the only answer he gave, and it was enough. By the end of the month, the Golden Pearl wasn't just a restaurant again, it was something else. A place where respect wasn't demanded, it was returned. Where people spoke not about what happened that night, but how they felt because of it. And in the silence, in the spaces between broken plates and soft tea pours, the real story remained alive. It was a rainy afternoon when the front door of the Golden Pearl creaked open. The usual hum of conversation quieted, chopsticks paused mid-air, and every head in the dining room turned. In the doorway stood a man no one expected to see again. "Lee," Way. But something was different. Gone was the flashy jacket, the aggressive swagger, the cocky smirk. He wore plain clothes now. An untucked button-down shirt, worn jeans, shoes that looked like they had seen miles of sidewalk without complaint. His hair was shorter, neater. His eyes searched the room, not with challenge, but uncertainty. The regulars remembered him. How could they forget? The chaos, the shattered dishes, Mr. Wang's injured arm. The way Keanu Reeves had moved like a whisper through violence. Never striking first, never bragging after. Lee took one step in, then another. He didn't look for a table. He didn't order anything. He walked straight to the front counter, where Mr. Wang was pouring tea for a young couple. Mr. Wang looked up slowly. Lee bowed. Not a small nod, but a full, respectful bow, from the waist. The kind taught in the old schools. The kind that said, "I come in peace." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Lee said softly. "I came to say thank you, and to apologize." His voice was quieter than anyone remembered. No arrogance, just sincerity. The whole restaurant listened in silence. Lee continued, "I was raised thinking strength meant control, meant fear. That day, I wasn't just fighting Mr. Wang. I was fighting my own pain. I see that now." He turned to face the room. "I hurt people. I disrespected a place that meant something to a lot of folks. I didn't understand what I was stepping into, but since then, I've been learning." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small flyer. He unfolded it carefully and placed it on the counter. It was a photo of a community gym, a simple space with padded floors, mirrors on the wall, and a line of kids in matching uniforms. "I've started teaching. Not fighting, discipline, stillness, respect. I tell every student what happened here, not about Keanu, not about the fight, but about the lesson." Mr. Wang didn't speak for several moments. Then, with quiet strength, he stepped out from behind the counter and looked Lee in the eyes. "I forgive you," he said, "and I believe you." Lee's eyes welled, just a little. He nodded once. Behind them, at a back corner booth, Keanu Reeves watched silently, a warm tea in hand. He said nothing, but he nodded too. The restaurant began to move again, but something had shifted. Conversations didn't resume right away. There was a pause, a reverence in the air. The kind of silence that didn't come from fear or tension, but from respect. A few of the elders nodded quietly toward Lee. One woman, who had shielded her grandson during the chaos months ago, placed her hand gently on the boy's shoulder and whispered something about forgiveness. Lee stood awkwardly at the center of it all, unsure whether to stay or go. It was Keanu who rose from his seat in the corner, his tea now finished, and walked slowly toward the door. As he passed Lee, he stopped. Not to shake hands, not to deliver some final word, but simply to acknowledge the moment. He gave Lee a steady look. Then he said the only thing needed. "Keep going." Lee swallowed hard. "I will." Keanu opened the door, letting in a soft breeze and the scent of rain on pavement. He held it for a second, looking back once at the golden pearl, not at the damage, not at the scars, but at the peace that had quietly returned. The wind caught the corner of the flyer Lee had left on the counter. Mr. Wang picked it up, smoothing the folds. He read the name of the new gym aloud in his mind. Balance Arts Studio. It was humble. It didn't boast. But it said everything. Lee turned to him once more. "Would it be all right if I sent the kids here sometime? Just to meet you? Maybe to hear from someone who really understands what it means to carry power gently?" Mr. Wang studied him for a long moment. Then he said, "Only if you come with them. They should know who you used to be and who you chose to become." Lee's jaw tightened, the way it does when emotion knocks against pride. He nodded. "I'd be honored." He turned to leave, and this time the click of the door behind him was not sharp like a judgment. It was soft, like the end of a chapter. Inside the Golden Pearl, the diners returned to their meals. Someone restarted the radio behind the counter. Dishes clinked gently. Mr. Wang reached for a rag and began wiping the countertop. A small boy at the front asked his mother, "Was that the same man from before?" His mother leaned down and whispered, "Yes, but he's different now." The boy looked thoughtful. "Because of the man with the tea?" She smiled. "Because of both of them." Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone and the soft hum of cleanup filled the room, Keanu remained behind. He and Mr. Wang sat once more at the corner booth, where quiet had always been their most honest language. "Did you expect him to come back?" Mr. Wang asked, pouring the last of the tea into 2 small cups. Keanu took a moment before answering. "I hoped he would, but expecting redemption from someone else. That's like expecting a plant to bloom just because you watered it once." Mr. Wang nodded slowly. "Still, you planted the seed." "I only moved the dirt out of the way," Keanu replied. "He chose to grow." There was a moment of stillness between them. Then Mr. Wang's eyes drifted toward the door. "He bowed with his whole body today. That tells me more than anything he said." Keanu sipped his tea and looked around the restaurant. This place? It teaches without speaking." Mr. Wang smiled. "It always has. Discipline, grace, strength without noise." They sat in that understanding, the kind that only comes from age and pain and long-remembered struggle. Outside, the city buzzed, but inside, time moved like incense smoke, slow and meaningful. A small envelope sat on the edge of the table. Mr. Wang picked it up and handed it to Keanu. "Alf left this. Said it was for your scholarship fund." Keanu opened it to find a stack of carefully folded bills and a handwritten note, "For the ones who need a second chance, like I did." He didn't smile, but something softened in his eyes. Later, as Keanu left the Golden Pearl, the night air felt different, less heavy. Across the street, a few kids were practicing slow martial arts forms under a street lamp, mimicking movements they had only seen online or through a window. Keanu paused and watched. One of the kids noticed him, froze mid-pose, and nudged the others. They whispered excitedly, unsure if it was really him. Keanu gave them a gentle wave and continued walking. Behind him, the movements resumed. Slower, more focused, more intentional. Inside the restaurant, Mr. Wang stood at the window and watched the scene unfold. He didn't say anything. He just exhaled and let it all soak in. It wasn't the kind of ending that came with applause or lights. It was better. It was peace. Keanu stepped quietly past the prep counter, the same stretch of tile where dumpling dough had once scattered during laughter-filled nights. His hand, relaxed but thoughtful, brushed against the wall as he moved. The restaurant was full but hushed, the sound of soft chopsticks and muted conversation rippling gently like wind through bamboo. Near the kitchen's edge, above a wooden panel Mr. Wang had long wanted to replace, a small plaque now hung, simple, weathered bronze. It read, "Power is how you move when you don't need to." Keanu stopped in front of it. His eyes didn't flicker, but his body paused. That single sentence carried more weight than 1,000 cheers. The plaque had been installed days earlier by one of Wang's students, a teenager who'd once hidden during the chaos. Now he trained twice a week and helped serve tea on Sundays. No one had asked Keanu what he thought of the quote, and he never commented on it. But now, as he stood facing it, his silence seemed to answer for him. It wasn't pride, it was peace. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the familiar room. The Golden Pearl was alive again, full of families, old regulars and new guests who didn't know what had happened months ago. They came for the dumplings. They stayed for something else they couldn't name. Safety, stillness, something rare. Mr. Wang caught Keanu's eye from across the room. He gave a small nod, more gesture than greeting. There was no need for words. Their bond had been forged in an era long gone, years before cameras and crowds, when discipline came from repetition, not recognition. Keanu made his way toward the front door. No one stopped him. No one asked for a selfie. A few diners looked up, unsure if they were imagining who they thought they saw, but his quiet made them question their instincts, and his stillness told them not to interrupt. At the threshold, Keanu turned once more. He watched as one of the young kids from Mr. Wang's class helped an elderly woman settle into a booth, her walker folded neatly, her smile broad. That, more than anything, was the victory. Outside, the sun poured down the alley with gentle warmth. The sky above Chinatown was clear. A pigeon fluttered by, landing near the faded red awning. Keanu stepped into the light without fanfare, without goodbye. His figure dissolved into the late afternoon crowd. Just another man among many. Walking with purpose, carrying no title. Back inside, someone began humming softly in the kitchen. A waiter dropped a spoon. It clinked, harmless and ordinary. Music resumed over the speaker system, a low instrumental track. Conversations bloomed again, like flowers after rain. The Golden Pearl had changed, not because of violence, not because of fame, but because someone had reminded them what strength could look like when it wasn't looking to be seen. That night, after closing time, Mr. Wang sat alone at the same table Keanu had once chosen, the one in the far corner, tucked away beneath a faded lantern. The hum of the refrigerator buzzed quietly behind the counter. He poured himself a cup of jasmine tea and stared at the empty chair. He didn't need company to feel the room was full. It was. Full of memory, full of echoes. That particular spot had once been avoided after the incident, but now it had become a place of quiet reverence. Even the newer staff seemed to instinctively treat it with gentleness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph. It was from the early days, when the restaurant had just opened. Keanu was there, standing beside him, both younger, laughing, aprons on. Mr. Wang traced the edge of the photo with one calloused finger. He didn't smile, but there was a glint of pride in his tired eyes. On the other side of town, in a quiet hotel room, Keanu sat at a window. No lights on, just the city's soft glow illuminating his face. He wasn't reflecting on the fight, or even on Lee. He was thinking of the girl who had asked, "Are you really John Wick?" Her voice had cut through him, not because of the name, but because of the innocence behind it. She didn't ask with fear. She asked with wonder. And his answer, given instinctively, now echoed back. "Only when I have to be." That moment stayed with him longer than the fight ever could, because at the end of the day, it wasn't about whether he had moved fast enough, hit hard enough, or looked calm doing it. It was about who saw him, what they learned, and what they carried with them. Sometimes the most important part of a story wasn't the action. It was what lingered afterward. Back at the Golden Pearl, the next morning brought sunlight through the front windows. The place opened early. A father brought his young son in for a quick breakfast before school. An elderly man played xiangqi with a friend at the back table. The same life, restored. The only thing that had changed was everything beneath the surface. On the wall near the kitchen, someone had added a second plaque, not as polished as the first. Just a small wooden sign, hand-painted, barely legible but deeply felt. It read, "Not about fighting, it's about standing." Beneath it, a growing row of red ribbons fluttered, on hooks, left behind by students who completed their first lesson in Wang's class. One ribbon belonged to the very boy who once hid under a table when Lee had stormed in. Now he helped sweep the restaurant floors every Saturday morning, chin high. No ceremony, no medal, just quiet purpose. And as this chapter comes to a close, we're left with a question. What if strength isn't about how loud you are? What if justice doesn't roar, but walks in, calm as tea, and leaves before you even know you've been changed? If you believe strength is silent and justice doesn't need applause, comment, "I believe." And if you want more stories where kindness wins in the quietest ways, subscribe. The next lesson might be yours.